Hello and welcome to Rotary Rocketry. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Mr. Dan Pollino. Hi, Dan. Thanks for coming on and talking with me today.
Howdy.
So now, those of you that don't know the name Dan Pollino, Dan is credited with being the person who invented Flexi-Fuel rocket fuel. Now, personally, if I had not discovered Flexi-Fuel a few years back, I probably wouldn't have gotten into amateur rocketry. The first time I saw Flexi-Fuel being made on YouTube, I said, I can do that. And it was really that confidence that got me started building my own rockets and specifically my own motors as well. It really was the simplicity of FlexiFuel that convinced me that I could actually do it. So kind of in an indirect way, Dan, you're responsible for the creation of the Rotary Rocketry YouTube channel.
It is not
So
my fault.
Dan, sorry, go ahead.
I said it's not my fault.
Oh, okay. So before we get to talking about FlexiFuel, I'm curious what got you interested in amateur rocketry and specifically experimental rocketry of making your own rockets and motors?
Sure, sure. Well, when I was in the sixth grade, I had a teacher named Mr. Zimmerman who used a lot of practical exercises for lessons. And in other words, we did the stock market. We would pretend he would give us fake $100 or something, and we every day we would invest in stocks, and it was a lesson to teach us fractions and math and things like that. And of course, nowadays in the sixth grade, people are learning calculus, but back then it was fractions. And so for one of our projects, it was we were going to launch a rocket, and everybody could build their own rocket and put it together, and we would go launch it on the ball field. So most everybody, of course, just went out and bought, Estes kits. But all I could, my parents could afford for me was an engine. So I had to put the rest of the rocket together with stuff that I found around the house. So I used a paper towel roll and cardboard and glue and tape and you name it. And it was way too heavy, and it was just a beast, and it was ugly, but I built it. And when it came time to launch them, everybody's went up, and you know how those were. They went up about 100 feet, and the parachute came out, and it's all great. So mine launched, and it went up about a foot, right? Like it went up that foot really slowly too. It just went up about a foot, and then it cut out and fell down on the side. And then about a second later, the parachute popped out on the ground all ridiculously, and everybody laughed, and it was a great time. But I didn't care because I built it, and it was a great experience building it. And I was bit by that builder bug, and it was addictive. And from that point on, I really wanted to try to build something on my own that worked, because that one obviously didn't. So it was a challenge to me to go ahead and try something, make something work. So.
That's cool. So I understand that sometime in the early 2000s, you began using a recipe for rocket fuel and you called it Flexi Fuel.
Yep.
So for the people watching that are not familiar with Flexi Fuel, can you explain what that is?
Well, normal sugar fuel is just sugar and potassium nitrate, just granulated sugar. So you can equate it to like a Jolly Rancher or something like that, a piece of candy that's very brittle. And the biggest problem with that is when you add pressure to it, it has a tendency to crack. So Flexi Fuel is, instead of granulated sugar, it uses powdered sugar, which is finer, and then corn syrup and potassium nitrate. So the thing I really liked about Flexi Fuel, well, that and the regular sugar fuel that made it so fun to experiment about, is that it is safe relatively. I mean, you could cut it with a saw, you could bang it with a hammer, you could even eat it if you wanted to, and it's all good. So that's what Flexi Fuel is.
So basically the main change there was the addition of the corn syrup. And that
Yes,
was really about the trying to make it less brittle.
that's correct.
So before you came up with Flexi Fuel, were you making motors with other types of fuel?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was inspired by Richard Naka, who I'm sure he's still doing work up in Canada with
Yep.
his work on sugar. But the problem was that I was using I was using PVC for the rocket casing, not machine metal like Richard. So I couldn't use the typical fuel shape, which burns on the outside and the inside at the same time, or on the top and bottom of the core and the inside, to keep pressure the same, because that heats up the casing. So
Mhm.
with With metal, that's not an issue, but with PVC, it can't handle the pressure, and when it gets hot, it just loses its structural um, capacity really quick. So I had to use a core burning design, something that kept the flame away from the PVC until the fuel was spent. But the problem, of course, like I said, with the sugar fuel is that since it was burning from the inside out, that pressure in the core would just push on the fuel, and it would crack, even though it was being held tight in there with the PVC. It's still a tremendous amount of pressure, and it still cracked it. And then once it cracked, it would cause more surface area to burn, and then the pressure would increase, it would crack more, and it would just cascade until it would explode. So with FlexiFuel, the fuel bends under the pressure and it doesn't crack. So you can have a core burning fuel without worrying about it cracking.
Mhm. So the addition of corn syrup, did you choose corn syrup because it was cheap and readily available, or was there some other reason for choosing corn syrup specifically?
Um, I'm not gonna lie to you. I got really frustrated a lot of times. I mean, because I was watching engine after engine fail,
Mhm.
and I knew I could make it work. And sometimes it did work, but a lot of times it didn't. And there were times I would just quit for weeks or months at a time, and do something else because I was just frustrated with it. But one day I was at 7-Eleven getting some lunch, and they had a little container of the little square caramels on the counter, individual ones, the little wrapped ones. And so I picked one up and squeezed it, and I was like, this is exactly what I need my fuel to be like. This doesn't crack. And I knew caramel is primarily sugar. So after a few batches using, caramel ingredients, which is corn syrup, I came up with the flexible fuel design. And trying to keep the ratio of, because corn syrup is, obviously sugar. And then trying to keep the ratio still to 60-40 so that still had the right amount of oxygen, the right amount of fuel. So, but it worked. You could bend it.
So we have 7-Eleven to thank for that.
Yeah, yeah, you do. You do.
So in preparation for talking to you today, I watched every one of your videos probably about a month ago or so when I contacted you. I can tell you, I honestly felt your pain every time you had a lawn dart come down. Same thing in our early years. We had a lot of those. It seemed like most of them seemed to come down nose first. So your YouTube channel was really active from about 2008 to 2011, but your last video was about 12 years ago. Have you still been involved with amateur rocketry since then, or is something that you're just not into anymore?
No, not really. In 2011, kind of I accomplished what I had set out to do 15 years earlier, which was to launch and recover one rocket 3 times in one day. And I know it's kind of random. I don't know why I set that goal for myself. I don't even remember why three and not two, and why I don't know. But and it doesn't even seem like that challenging of a thing. But everything on the rocket was made from parts from Home Depot or Lowe's or some hardware store or something like that. None of it was machined or um, purchased. So as like a flight computer or something like that. So everything on there was made by me, and it all it would take was just one thing to fail, and it would. So that getting that to launch one rocket, the same one 3 times in one day successfully, and bring it back. I mean, there was so many factors that you got close to it, but it just never worked out. Sometimes on the third time or on the second time, you'd lost the rocket. It came down fine, but you never found it out there in the desert. So, I it took a lot of years to make that happen, and in 2011 it did. So after that, I worked with hybrids for a bit, and then I started writing after that. And after a few years, I moved up to Washington State to help my folks. And this area really isn't conducive to amateur rocketry. There's way too many trees. Here in the western part of the state. So
You talked about your final videos there of the hybrids. So something occurred in your final YouTube video that I wanted to talk to you about. I don't know if you remember the exact details, but you were trying to develop a combination solid motor and hybrid motor all in one. And during one of the ground tests, the flame seemed to feed back through the nitrous oxide supply tube, got into the nitrous tank, and exploded the tank, which I'm sure made a fairly good boom. You had some commentary after the explosion, and I could definitely tell by your demeanor and definitely in your voice that you were pretty shaken up. Do you remember the details of that?
Absolutely. That is not something you easily forget. And it was a fantastic idea. The idea was to use a sugar rocket to start to get the rocket going up to speed, and then once the fuel was spent and the coast was going, the nitrous would kick in and actually use the PVC casing as fuel, and burn, and then burn the rest of the way.
Hmm.
But even with check valves, relief valves, and flashback arresters in place, that tank still exploded, and it was an aluminum tank, um, and there was nothing left of it. I mean, there were aluminum when it ruptures, it makes these jagged, sharp edges. I mean, it was like having a bunch of knives out there. It was, and we weren't close to it by any means. I mean, we were being safe, but that was a whole nother level of, because when PVC explodes, it doesn't have a lot of mass, so it loses its momentum very, very quickly.
Hmm.
Metal, on the other hand, does not. And you could hear the pieces like zinging. It was just one of those, nope, that was my two hands up, nope moment. So that was it.
So did you do any further development with that design or even any other motors after that, or was that really the
No, 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 that was my nope.
so that was the end of motors as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, 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 it was. And like I said, when I was doing when I would get frustrated, I would quit for a bit and I would do another hobby. So my hobbies were kind of cyclical like that. Like I would get tired of one and do the other, and then get tired of that one and do the gonna just kind of go back to each one. So it was just one of those moments that I was like, I'm gonna go try something else. And then I just never went back to it, and eventually moved out of the state where I couldn't do it anymore anyway. So, and also you have to consider that before 9/11, it was very, very easy to get potassium nitrate. Like it was super easy. And now it's a little bit more difficult. And it was just everything was becoming more difficult. I mean, um, I don't know if they had a video on there of the sea launch on the ones that you watched.
I
I'll
don't
have
think
to
so.
I'll have to get that
You
one.
mean on the sea, where you launch from the sea?
Yeah, yeah, we launched rockets out in the ocean.
Oh,
But
no.
but in order to do that, I needed to we had the launcher, and the launcher had a float around the top. It was the same launcher that I used in the desert, the square unistrut tubing. And it had a float around the top so it didn't sink, but then I needed weights on the bottom to keep it kind of stable. So I went to, I think it was Big Five Sporting Goods or something sometime. I think it was Big Five. And I bought a couple 5 pound barbell weights. And so the guy came over and he's like, "Oh, are you gonna start lifting?" And like looking at my fat self. No, I'm not. But he's like, I'm like, no. And of course, I'm really excited about my project because how many times do you get to launch something in the middle of the ocean? So I'm like, no, I'm launching a rocket in the ocean and calling it Sea Launch. And of course, Sea Launch, the big people, they sent me a letter of cease and desist and everything for using that name.
Oh, geez.
But so he said, well, we can't sell you those. And I was like, why not? And he's like, we no, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. And I said, I'm just buying some barbells. And he's like, no, you have to leave. So there was definitely a change after 9/11.
Hmm.
People didn't want to hear about anything like that. Before, it used to be a school project or something like that. It was great. And afterwards, it was just done. So it was harder and harder to do it after that. So I just went to something else.
Hmm. That's crazy that they would do that. Now, another thing you're known for is large PVC motors, as you've already mentioned. And as you know, PVC motors are very controversial in the world of amateur rocketry. So I'll put up a picture here of you with one of the PVC K450 motors. It's an absolute beast of a motor. When you decided you were going to build PVC motors, did you jump immediately into doing like really big stuff like that, or did you start out with smaller designs?
No, I was building small motors for a long time, and none of them were really my design. They were things that were available online at the time. But over time, I got comfortable with a certain workflow process with things that worked, materials that I liked using, and I wound up with the K450. And I don't know why PVC is such a dirty word. I mean, You can't see it on an X-ray, so if it gets in you, that's a problem. But
Mhm.
like I said, it loses its velocity very quickly because of its low mass. And I don't know. I think it works great. I don't know why there's such a thing. But anyway, later on, built an L950. Um, and then I don't remember what the hybrid booster was rated at, but I know it had almost 1,000 pounds of thrust. So
Mm.
that one was just crazy, crazy. But with the K450 and the L950 being such reliable workhorses, once FlexiFuel was um, kind of used in them, I started stacking them together with PVC couplings and insulating the spaces in between with silicone, and they worked fine. So I never had any problem with PVC, and I think yeah the hybrid kind of killed it, but the L950 was fine for everything else it needed to do. So I never went bigger than that. So
Mm. That's definitely a monster.
yeah.
So back in the early 2000s, a television network called G4 contacted you to build several motors for one of their TV shows called It's Effin' Science. Now, for those of my viewers who have never heard of that show, it's not really that surprising. It was a pretty short-lived show that was kind of like a Mythbusters wannabe, but with really much more annoying hosts, to be perfectly honest. I'm curious, with all the various amateur rocketeers, rocket clubs, motor manufacturers, what led them to seek you out and hire you for that project?
Um, well, it's interesting about the clubs and everything because they all have a set of rules, kind of bylaws, things like that. And most of them have one that says no homemade engines. So I was never a part of any club for that very reason, because I like to make my own engines. So I think maybe so it had some part to do with that, and also probably just because I said yes, that they, you know, that I was willing to do what they wanted done, which was kind of strange. In addition to launching a rocket, they wanted to launch a porta potty. They wanted to make a rocket powered go-kart, and then of course use a rocket powered skateboard as well. So there was a lot of stuff that I'm sure the normal rocketry clubs would definitely shy away from. Uh,
So both you and the producers must have been pretty comfortable with the PVC motors, because there were two experiments that you mentioned, the rocket powered skateboard and the rocket powered go-kart, where people were very close to those motors, and again, being PVC motors being controversial, and the explosion of them really is what people are mostly afraid of. You guys must have been really confident with that design. How long had you been using that motor design prior to the TV show so that you actually had that level of confidence in igniting those motors that close to people?
Well, I don't remember how long, but I did not have that level of confidence. Absolutely not. So, I mean, by that point, I was making the K450s and the L950s that were very reliable as far as engines went. But they were still something that I assembled in my garage. And as with all rocketry components, all it takes is one thing to fail. One little component or one bubble or one something. It doesn't matter, and then everything fails. So the rocket powered go-kart had a big thick steel plate between the engines and where the person who was sitting was. So there was, I mean, there was no way that any part of that engine was going to touch the person. The rocket powered skateboard was a very low pressure engine by design, because obviously if you had a rocket engine on a skateboard, it would just fly away. It would kick you right out from under you. So it had to be very low pressure. So there was no danger from that one.
Hmm.
It also had a kill switch with a pressurized water tank that would flood the engine to extinguish the engine if the rider fell off. So there were definitely, safety um, precautions taken, um, that to prevent anything bad from happening. And of course, there was, paramedics and ambulance and fire department and all that too. So
So definitely a rare and unique opportunity for an amateur rocketeer to be featured on national television, regardless of what show it is. So that's
fun.
definitely certainly seems like an honor. So another one of your accomplishments is that you've published a couple of books on rocketry. I found three books that you've made for making rockets, motors, and as you mentioned, the rocket-powered skateboard. But in doing my research, I found used copies online. So I'm guessing the books are all out of print at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I ran them for several years, got a lot of copies out there, and with all things like that, they have a peak and then they start to decline. So after a while, we just took them off the market.
Hmm. But you did find that there was interest in books, even with all the availability of everything on YouTube, or was it really just because YouTube hasn't really progressed to where it is now?
Yeah, no, there definitely was. There was quite a bit of interest. Even some questionable interest from areas like the Middle East. They would send me emails and ask me that since Amazon didn't sell it to them, would I sell it to them directly? And I was like, no. And you know, but the thing was, these books were step-by-step books, right? So you can watch a video, you can read an article, but this is, I mean, step by step by step. It was almost 400 pages long for the L950 book,
Hmm.
or so. It wasn't just the engine; it was the entire rocket and all its systems. So everything had to be, I had to consider the reader as well, like what level of technical skill they have they ever used a drill do they know the difference between a Phillips and a standard screwdriver? I mean, you laugh, but some people don't, right? And they still want to build a rocket, and good for them. But there's a failure waiting to happen. So I tried to make it as foolproof and step by step as possible. So that's what differentiated it from a YouTube video or an article online.
Hmm. Did you ever hear from anyone who had used your books to build either a rocket or duplicate one of your motors?
Yeah, and honestly, that was my favorite part of this whole project, and never thought it would be. I mean, I thought, accomplishing the silly goal of putting the same rocket up 3 times in one day would be. But when people would email you or they'd send you a copy of the video they made, and there's your rocket, the thing that you poured years and years of time into, in somebody else's garage, and they were happy and they were excited. It was just that was the best part of the whole thing was, school groups, whoever made it. It was just a really great part. There was some bad comments on that book too. Somebody didn't like the cover of the I Still Have All My Fingers book. They said it was sexist because I covered up the danger sign with a 1950s like rocket girl pinup sticker on there. So it just said Dan instead of Danger, and that was my name. So I thought it was very clever, actually. But they said it was sexist, and there weren't enough women in science, and and I was promoting that stereotype. I was like, come on, like just build it. If you want to build it, build it. Like just stop complaining about it and just go build it. And then, some people said it was a book for babies because it was step by step. And yeah, if you have a certain skill with, building things and there's going to be a lot of redundancy there, but it's for the lowest common denominator, somebody who had never done this before and, had to go buy tools to do it and buy materials to do it. And it just led them through step by step. But that was definitely one of my favorite parts was when people were excited to share what they built because of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to reading through all the documentation you sent me. I've been looking for a powerful motor for we're going to be building a pretty large rocket for our 5,000 subscriber special, which is still quite a ways off, but got to look to the future. And so I'm definitely hoping to gain some insights from your work and decide what kind of motor I want to build for it. Not sure exactly what style, but I definitely like the smoke trail and the smoke element system that you have because we have definitely had issues launching too high and losing sight of the rocket pretty quickly and then deciding, do we want to spend an hour looking for this or should we just go home and call it a day? So the smoke element that you had on your Coyote design was definitely beneficial. Well, Dan, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so
Likewise.
much for visiting with me today.
Happy to be
I'm
here.
hoping to get up to your part of the country. I've got two boys that live fairly close to where you are, and
Nice.
meeting you in person, that would be fantastic. I looked up your small little town. It looks like a great place. I love that part of the country. That's all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about Dan and his accomplishments. As I mentioned earlier, his YouTube channel hasn't been active for quite some time, but the videos he does have are really interesting, so go check them out. There's a link to his channel down in the description. A huge thanks to Dan for joining us today. If you're not subscribed to our channel, hit that subscribe button, and please don't forget to hit that like button before you leave. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.